Continuing with trig functions of any angle. Sometimes they will tell us a trig function in the quadrant that the angle is in or the terminal side is in. So if we draw our third quadrant, we know that sine is opposite over hypotenuse. And if we recall that the hypotenuse is always positive, that makes the opposite side -5 over +13. So in order to find the adjacent side, we have to use the Pythagorean theorem. So we'll have a squared plus -5 squared equals 13 squared. -5 squared is 25. Subtract 25. We get a squared is 144. So a will be positive or -12. And what we have to figure out is that adjacent side going to be a positive number or a negative number? So what you have to remember is that in the third quadrant, the ordered pair is negative. So this is actually going to be a -12. And that's by virtue of being in the third quadrant. So let's make some space here. And we'll set up our trig ratios now that we have all the information that we need. So we know what sine is. That's easy. So cosecant is just going to be the reciprocal. Cosine of theta is adjacent over hypotenuse. So secant of theta is just the reciprocal, -13 over 12, or 13 over -12. If we look at tangent of theta, here we're going to get an opposite, which is -5, over adjacent, which is -12, which comes out to 5/12. And cotangent of theta is going to be the reciprocal. So it's interesting to note that this, all students take calculus rule. Here is where tangent is positive and cotangent is positive in the third quadrant. And you see why, because the x's and the y's are both negative. Looking at this next one, they didn't tell us what quadrant it's in. So we have to give that a little thought. And I like to label my quadrants. All students take calculus. If secant is +2, then that means cosine is 1/2. So cosine is positive. So we could either be in this quadrant, quadrant 4, where cosine is positive, or we could be in this quadrant, quadrant 1, where everything is positive. But it says here, it gives us another little piece of information. It says that sine of theta is less than 0. So that means that not everything, not all trig functions are positive. So we have to be in quadrant 4. And we've already found the cosine of theta. So that only leaves us with a little bit to do. So if we draw quadrant 4, if cosine is 1/2, that means adjacent to theta and hypotenuse are 1 and 2. So we can find the opposite side by using Pythagorean theorem. One plus x squared equals 4, x squared equals 3, and x is either going to be positive or negative square root of 3. So if we think about the quadrant that we're in, quadrant 4, this is negative x values, positive y values. So this is going to be negative square root of 3. And I'll just write that in directly on our graph, negative square root of 3. So now we can find sine of theta, which is O over H, and cosecant of theta, which is the reciprocal. And we can find tangent of theta, which is O over A, and cotangent of theta, which is the reciprocal. In this problem, again, we don't know what quadrant we are in or the angle is in. So let's draw a little sketch. All students take calculus. And it says here that tangent is negative, so we can't be here, we can't be here. And it says that cosine is positive, so we must be again in quadrant 4. Now, if tangent is negative 5, tangent is opposite over adjacent. That would mean that tangent, the x would need to be negative, so negative 5 over 1. So this is very similar to the problem before we had, just before this slide. So we're going to find the hypotenuse this time. And that'll be 26. Remember, the hypotenuse is always positive. So there we go. Now from here, we know that the cotangent is just the reciprocal. So that's negative 1 over 5. We know that sine is opposite, which is negative 5 over hypotenuse. And cosecant is the reciprocal. And we know that cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, which makes secant the reciprocal.